than that, any questions, comments, please let me know. I'd be happy to help. Work hard, study hard. Let's get to our questions. 81. Interview skills are important to learn when hunting for a job. If a behavior analyst wants to program interview skills for maintenance, which of the following is the least likely to be effective? Be careful here. What do we need to be concerned with? We need to be concerned with this least likely, this word least. So we're not looking for the best way to program for maintenance. We're looking for the worst way. We need to be very careful when reading our questions. If we read our questions carefully, if we do our work up front, and if we start predicting answers, it's going to be a lot better than if we try to rush through the question, jump right to the answers, and then answer our questions that way. You're going to miss things, okay? You're going to spend more time doing it that way, rather than you just spend all your time up front on the question and then get to the answer choices. So we're looking for the least likely way to program for maintenance. Maintenance is a skill persisting once teaching stops. And if we want a skill to persist once teaching stops, what we're looking for is that client contacting reinforcement from the natural environment, from people other than us who taught them that skill. Maintenance and generalization are one and the same, right? If it's going to maintain, it's going to start to occur outside of the teaching environment. Okay, so we want the least likely way that's going to occur. A, ensure that as much natural reinforcement is available from the start. Well, that's what we just predicted, right? We want as much natural reinforcement available for this skill. If this skill is only reinforced by contrived reinforcement, what happens once that reinforcement stops? Well, the behavior might stop as well. Okay, that behavior might be starting to be put on extinction unwillingly, but all the same, because that behavior is no longer receiving reinforcement. So A would be a good way to program for maintenance. B, use a continuous reinforcement schedule as long as possible to strengthen the behavior. We want to fade our CRF as quickly as possible. A continuous reinforcement schedule reinforces every single instance of behavior. You want to fade that as quickly as possible, especially if you're programming for maintenance or programming for generalization. You need to fade the CRF to an intermittent schedule as quickly as you can. So B is going to be worse than A for maintenance. What about C? Fade teaching and run occasional maintenance checks before actual interviews. Well, this is great. We're actually running maintenance checks. We're fading our teaching. C, so far, would be a great way to program for maintenance. And then D, request that other technicians practice interviewing the client. Here, okay, we're using other people, allowing this client to contact reinforcement in other ways, not just from us or the quote unquote teaching environment. D would be a decent way to program for maintenance. The worst way is going to be B, using this continuous reinforcement schedule as long as possible. It's going to be the worst way to not only promote maintenance, but also to promote generalization. So B is our answer. 82, when developing a task chain for riding a bike, which of the following would be the least appropriate to use during your task analysis? This is always a tricky question. When we're doing a task analysis, we want the best task chain for the learner, but we also want the task chain based on an accurate way to perform the behavior. What we don't want to do is perform a task analysis on a person of the same skill level or same age as the learner. Now, age, of course, is relative, but if we're thinking in general terms, most frequently, same age, same skill, okay, we want to avoid. We'd rather go to people like experts, professionals, recording ourselves doing it, or just making a task chain and adjusting accordingly. That's better than observing someone of the same skill or age who might be doing it incorrectly. So all that being said, again, we're looking for the least appropriate way or the least appropriate person or stimuli to use for our task analysis. A, observe Lance Armstrong riding a bike. So Lance Armstrong is a professional bike rider. He would, we assume, be a great person to consult for a task chain for riding a bike. So A would be appropriate. B, record yourself riding a bike and generate a chain from that. Adjust accordingly. Sure, as long as you're proficient in riding a bike, you're going to know how to ride a bike better than the person you're teaching, we can assume, and then you can adjust accordingly. This is totally acceptable. C, consult a professional teacher. Absolutely, a professional bike riding teacher would probably be better than even us at generating this task analysis for whatever age the learner is. So far, A, B, and C are all appropriate. That leaves us with D, observe other children the same age riding bikes. Now, you might say, well, what if these children have a strong proficiency in bike riding? That may be the case, but all those children have a strong proficiency in riding bikes? Doubtful, right? Better than a professional bike rider, a professional teacher, or an adult who can generate a chain from watching yourself? Probably not. And if we're going by the textbook definition, okay, A, B, and C are textbook ways to develop a task chain. D, observing other children the same age or same skill riding bikes, is not. So it's the least appropriate way, or the least appropriate way to develop a task analysis would be D, observing other children the same age riding bikes. Okay, 83. Which of the following is the correct order of operations when running discrete trials? This question is pretty easy. I'm really testing to see if you understand where does the prompt fall in this order of operations. I see it all the time, even from BCBAs. We're prompting incorrectly. We're prompting after the consequence. The prompt is coming before the SD. The prompt comes after the SD, before the response. Remember, a prompt is just a temporary SD. So it would follow that it comes after the SD, but before the response. So that being said, when running a discrete trial, what comes first? Well, in SD, of course, we give the SD. A, C, and D have the SD first. B does not. We can eliminate B. What follows the SD, assuming we're using prompts, right? In this case, we are using prompts. Does the prompt or the response follow the SD? The prompt comes immediately after the SD and immediately before the response. So if we look at A, it has SD response prompt, and then D, SD response consequence. That is incorrect. The order is SD, then prompt, then response, then a consequence, a brief pause, we start again. Again, what I'm really testing for is your knowledge of where does that prompt fall. That prompt falls after the SD, before the response. All the prompt is a temporary SD that we want to fade as quickly as possible. 84, you always wake up before your wife and prepare breakfast. This morning, however, your wife woke up first and wants to cook you something. From downstairs, she yells, "What do you want to eat?" You yell back, "Pancakes." What verbal operant is on display? Okay, be careful here. What is occurring here? Well, we have an exchange. We have this question and then this answer. What verbal operant is on display? Well, ask yourself, if our response is pancakes, is it evoked by a verbal SD? It is. What do you want to eat? Okay. Can this be a man? No, because a man is evoked by what? A man is evoked by an MO. So if you just walked down, saw your wife, or you just walked downstairs and you just said, "I want pancakes," that's different than answering the SD, "What do you want to eat?" And that's really the key difference here, and why you need to know what evokes verbal operants, what reinforces verbal operants, and then do they have point-to-point correspondence, and do they have formal similarity? You have to know those characteristics. That's what the test is testing you on. So, all that said, what verbal operant is on display? Is this an interverbal? Absolutely. Evoked by a verbal SD. Okay. No point-to-point correspondence. Conversational, answering a question. It's going to be an interverbal. It's not a man because an MO didn't evoke it. It's not a textual. Okay. We're not reading anything. And it's not an echoic because it does not have point-to-point correspondence. If your wife said, "What do you want to eat?" and you yelled back, "What do you want to eat?" that would be an echoic. 85. Tony has trouble making decisions, so his sister is going to use a free operant arrangement to identify what Tony likes. Which of the following best represents a free operant arrangement? When you see free operant, just think naturalistic, think uncontrived. All right, where you're just observing the learner in their natural environment without interfering and manipulating. So if we're going to use a free operant arrangement to identify what Tony likes, what are we doing? Well, it sounds to me like a free operant preference assessment or almost a naturalistic preference assessment. That being said, let's try to find that in our answer choices. We've made our prediction. That's what we're looking for. A, Tony's sister presents several items on a table and asks Tony to pick the ones he likes. Well, this is contrived. It's not free operant. Okay. This looks like maybe some sort of multiple stimulus assessment. We're not really sure. All we know is that Tony's sister is contriving it. It's not free operant. B, throughout the day, Tony's sister will ask if Tony likes or dislikes certain items. Again, we're not observing Tony in the natural environment. It's not a free operant. Okay. Depending on how many items are being presented, this could be a single choice preference assessment. We're not really sure. Again, we just know it's not free operant. C, Tony's sister will observe Tony as he plays alone in his room. Yes, Tony is in his own environment. He is not being asked or told to play with anything. We're simply observing him in this free operant setup. C looks good. What about D, at the dinner table? Tony's sister says, do you like fruit or vegetables? This is a forced choice, which is not a free operant arrangement. C is going to be our best answer. It's the most naturalistic. It's the most quote unquote free. 86, which of the following answer choices best describes self-management? All right, the only reason I put this question in here is so you're familiar with the actual definition of self-management. I think it gets a little confused, okay? A lot of times it's confused with self-control. We don't use self-control. Self-control is a misnomer. What controls behavior? The environment, right? Consequences, that kind of thing, antecedents. So self-management has a very specific definition. If we look in the book, there's a very specific word that describes self-management. So A, self-management is applying behavior change strategy to one's own behavior to produce a positive change. Well, typically we'll use self-management for a positive change, but if you really wanted to, couldn't you use self-management for a negative change? I guess if you wanted to, you could, right? So self-management isn't always going to be a positive or a negative change, okay? What about producing a change? Well, self-management producing a change would be okay, but what if it's not the change we wanted? Is that really effective, or is that really self-management? No, just because something's changing doesn't mean it's what we wanted. Self-management is applying behavior change strategies to one's own behavior to produce a desired change. That word desired is the key in the definition of self-management. So our answer here is going to be D, none of the above. So yeah, this is really strictly a definition question, but I'm just trying to make you aware of that word desired. Okay, it's not necessarily positive. It's not necessarily negative. We want a desired change. We want the change to be what we wanted as a result of self-management. 87, to most effectively transfer stimulus control from a prompt to a desired SD, which of the following should you avoid doing? Again, like we talked about earlier, a prompt is just a temporary SD, but that response is under the control of the prompt. We really want it under the control of our desired SD. And in order to do that, we have to transfer control from the prompt to the SD. And how do we do that? Well, we would fade that prompt, okay? We would use the prompt as little as possible, only use as much prompting as necessary, okay? Many ways to do that. Now, what does the question ask? Again, be careful. It says, which of the following should you avoid doing? Okay, so what are we going to avoid doing if we want to transfer control from the prompt to our SD? A, using physical prompts for longer than necessary to ensure the skill is learned. Is using physical prompts, the most intrusive prompts, for longer than necessary, the best way to essentially fade a prompt? Stimulus transfer control, you're essentially fading a prompt, okay? You're just transferring control from one SD to another. But using this physical prompt, this most intrusive prompt for longer than necessary, is not going to be the best way to do that. A is a very good way to develop a prompt dependency not a good way necessarily to fade the prompt. So far, A looks like our answer, but we have 3 more answer choices. We don't just pick the first answer we like and move on. We read all of our answer choices and go from there, okay? So B, using graduated guidance. Graduated guidance is a type of physical prompting where you're only using as much physical prompting as necessary and then quickly fading. So while you're using physical prompting, graduated guidance encourages only using as much as necessary and then fading immediately. So B is going to be at least better than A. This is why we're going through all of our answer choices, okay? Why are the right ones right? Why are the wrong ones wrong? C, implement prompts near the start of the teaching plan and then fade to less prompts as needed. Absolutely. Fading, fading, fading. Okay, that's the key. And then D, reinforce the behavior when it occurs in the presence of the desired SD. Absolutely. If we always reinforce only in the presence of the prompt, that prompt will always maintain control. We need to reinforce the behavior when it occurs in the presence of the SD and not the prompt. So the best way, or the worst way, right, the least effective way, okay, or the one we should avoid doing to transfer stimulus control from a prompt to a desired SD would be A, using physical prompts for longer than necessary to ensure the skill is learned. This is just a great way to ensure a prompt dependency. 88. You celebrated New Year's Eve by attending a huge party your friend threw at her house. The next day, you woke up with a massive headache. You took Advil, which stopped the headache. In terms of your behavior on the day after the party, taking Advil is what? Is Advil a response, a consequence, a positive reinforcer, or a punisher? Behavior questions, okay, we need to break them down. We need to assign antecedents, responses, and consequences to them. If you're not doing that, behavior questions become tricky and you're going to make silly mistakes. So what are we looking at? We're looking at taking Advil. What happens right before the Advil? Well, you wake up with a massive headache. That's our antecedent. Our response is taking Advil. Our consequence is the headache goes away. So in terms of your behavior on the day after the party, taking Advil is what? It's a response. In this situation, right, it's a response. We have our antecedent. You woke up with a massive headache. In response, you took Advil. The consequence was it stopped the headache. Okay. So now is Advil, we're not necessarily looking at the effect of the reinforcer here or the effect of the consequence. And that's where people want to jump on behavior questions. They're always thinking about, okay, well, is it a reinforcer? Is it a punisher? It's not really relevant here, right? Because they're not asking about what happens after you take the Advil. They're talking about just the response of the Advil. Again, you have to read the questions carefully and answer what the question is asking. Don't make assumptions about the question. The question is going to give you all the information you need. Answer the question, given the information, and answer the question they're asking. 89, you instructed your RBT to take partial interval data on your client's screaming behavior. The RBT recorded the following data. How many responses should you expect to see reported? What are we dealing with? We're dealing with partial interval data. What does partial interval data say? It says if the behavior occurs at all during the interval, it counts as a response. So we have our data here. How many responses should we expect to see reported? If we look at the top, we're working in 15-second intervals. Knowing its partial interval, how long does the behavior need to occur? If the behavior occurs for 1 second, if the behavior occurs at any point during the interval, right, it's a response. So let's see. Interval 1, 12. Then we have 8 seconds, interval 2, 9 seconds, 1, 1, 15, 15, 4. Okay. Did the behavior occur in every interval? Yes. Doesn't matter how long it occurred with partial interval data. If it occurred at all, it's going to count as a response. So how many responses should we expect to see? Well, we have 8 intervals. Excuse me, the behavior happened. In all 8 intervals, we should expect to see 8 responses. People really struggle with partial interval, whole interval, and momentary. All right. Put it in charts like this. Break it down. Okay. We have a blog on the site on this type of measurement. Okay. That I recommend you reading if you're struggling with this interval and this time sampling collection. And then 90, After a supervision session, Ricky decides he is going to implement some TAC training as part of his client's skill acquisition plan. If Ricky wants to properly train tacting, how should he do it? All right, we need to teach verbal behavior using behavior analytic principles and verbal operant principles. How do we train tacting? In order to train tacting, we need to know what tacting is. Tacting is a label. Is tacting evoked by a verbal SD or a nonverbal SD? It's evoked by a nonverbal SD and is reinforced typically with a generalized conditioned reinforcer. So knowing that, how are we going to teach tacting? A, deprive the client of cookie for several hours. Deliver the client a cookie when they say cookie. If we're depriving the client of cookies, what are we doing? We're manipulating the motivating operation. A is going to be a mand. The client saying cookie when they've been deprived of the cookie is in the presence of an MO, which makes it a mand. Also, right, there's from the question or from the answer choice, it doesn't appear that there's a cookie in the presence of the person. A tact, we're labeling the cookie. So if we're going to teach tact training, there needs to be a cookie present. B, deliver reinforcement whenever the client says cookie after someone else says, I want a cookie. Well, this could be anything from an intraverbal to a partial echoic, okay? But it's in response to a verbal SD, which makes it not a tact. C, provide a generalized condition reinforcer when the client says cookie at any point during the day. Again, what did we say on A? If we're teaching tact training, whatever we're teaching to tact needs to be in the presence when we're training, of course. So D, provide a generalized condition reinforcer when the client says cookie in the presence of a cookie. Yes, okay. There's a cookie on the table. Client says cookie, right? Doesn't seem to be any MO in place, right? We're also delivering a generalized condition reinforcer and not the cookie. All these things make up tact training. Verbal operants can get tricky, okay, if we don't really know what evokes, what reinforces, and then point-to-point correspondence and formal similarity. If you know those four things about our verbal operants, you're never missing one of these questions. Okay, thanks for watching. Check out